And then he went to Cornell for his Juris Doctor. And then he worked for the Rockefeller campaign. Nelson Rockefeller ran for president. And he met this interesting German immigrant named Henry Kissinger. And the rest is history, because Kissinger rode the bullet to the top, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, and David worked for Henry Kissinger. He worked in the West Wing of the White House, and he worked there during Watergate. So he leaves the United States, goes to England, goes to Oxford, receives his doctorate. You got, I think, a doctor in philosophy. Is that right? DPhil? Yes. And then he, never say die, founds a company called Oxford Analytica. Please do not make the mistake, one of my fellow faculty members, that it is not Cambridge Analytica. That's the company that was data mining with Facebook a year or two ago. They don't do that kind of work. It's a private intelligence firm. And I wanted to pick someone with significance for my first podcast, which will be released soon, and Dr. Young was my first interviewee. It was so hard. It was like trying to lasso lightning, because he's got decades of great, important experiences and stories to tell, and I had 25 minutes. So without further ado, Dr. Young. Thank
you. All my kids keep telling me is, no more stories, Dad. Including my wife. It's a privilege to be back, and thank you all so much. Thank you, David, and thank you to the Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics, which I think is a great lighthouse in the way that integrates three really critical disciplines. I also want to thank Bill Pollard, who David's already mentioned, because almost 20 years ago, in 2000, early 2000, the Service Master Foundation had endowed a series of lectures around the country in major universities. And I was privileged to be asked to give the one at Yale, and that's where I'd made the first stab at what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. And I was just thinking, sitting here I'm going to be plagiarizing myself, so don't tell anybody. The backstory, you've got it pretty well right. I thought at these times I should mention that my father was an immigrant from Belfast in 1927 when he was 22 years old, had 3 sons. 2 of us came to Wheaton. And I think that fits into the whole American story and the connection of our going back and forth and living now the last 40 years in Oxford. And having 5 children, all born there, 3 of whom actually came to Wheaton. And Wheaton did give me a framework that I look back on and I said, this framework gave us the kind of posts along the way, the lighthouses along the way, and the framework of faith that enabled us to go through this journey, and how good the Lord has been, and the Lord's favor in so many ways. David has mentioned the link to Kissinger and the Rockefellers and in the White House in the end of '69. And what I want to share is some reflections and then try and give you a framework for thinking about power that could hopefully help you navigate where we are. What's been important to me since I left the White House and thinking about what's going on around the world. And the main thing, the starting point, is the most overriding and profound memory of my 4 years in the White House almost was having to do with a sense of battle. And not a battle between armed forces or guerrilla warfare in Vietnam, or a battle on negotiating front with the Russians on the nuclear weapons strategic arms treaty, or even a battle in terms of economic power and trade blocs and negotiations there. But a battle that was kind of somehow above that. And bear with me, because some of these terms I'm going to keep pounding away at, but it's kind of looking at the world as broadly as you can. And I left the White House thinking, wow, what a sense of battle. What was that battle about? It was a sense of a battle over power, a spiritual battle between right and wrong, good and bad, good and evil. There was something out there that you sense was at the battle. And it wasn't, I've written down here, by battle of power, spiritual battle between good and evil, at work in high places, but as well as being at work in the individual. And the link here between the high and the individual is really eloquently made by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his classic work, The Gulag Archipelago. And I want to quote from this. Many of you probably have already heard this quote. Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes, not between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. That's quite profound when you think he's somebody in this prison camp for years, and he comes out with this recognition that it isn't the party, it isn't the state, it's in the human heart, the line between good and evil. To this, I would only add that that line in the course of human history is written, I was going to say large, it is a profound distinction throughout human history, and it passes through all of the history of humanity, the battle between good and evil, in that it goes through each heart. As discouraging as that history may seem, my underlying assumption is that God is the God of history, and that in the end, in the last battle, good will prevail over evil. I didn't know we were going to be in the Wade Center with C.S. Lewis, but the last battle we all know from his Narnia tales. So what are the dimensions of power in the broadest sense? And as I just said, that throughout the chronology of history is the chronology of the exercise of power. And I propose that there are three, have been and are and will be, three dimensions of that power. The hard dimension of power is the tangible dimension. How many men do you have, missiles do you have, tanks, airplanes, submarines, warheads, etc. Two, the soft power dimension. That's been in vogue, particularly in the last 40 or 50 years, and more books on soft power. And that really includes everything from your intelligence system, your counterintelligence system, your strategy, diplomacy, economic power, cultural influence. And today it'd probably even be including all of artificial intelligence and everything that's coming into the social media, and cyber warfare as well. And it's almost as if soft power guides how hard power is used. So that's the first and second dimension. The third dimension is neither hard nor soft. It's not tangible, not intellectual. I like to call it the spiritual dimension, and it leads to wars of the spirit, battles between good and evil. As I've said, good and bad, right and wrong, unseen and supernatural. And it, in a way, determines the outcome of how hard and soft power are exercised. So 3 comments on these dimensions to begin with. First of all, if you want to visualize it, the hard and soft you could look at as the horizontal with a human element in the middle. And you can look at the spiritual dimension as vertical with the human element at the bottom and Almighty at the top. So you have this axis, and maybe that can just give you a way to think about what we're trying to talk about, because we go from the macro, comprehensive, global, universal view down to the individual. And behind those two axes and in impacting all dimensions is the question of character. The exercise of political power in all three dimensions depends on character. And I'll come to a little more on character in a minute. Now, I've written out 5 propositions. My wife says I can't read this, I just got to tell you. But I'm going to read you these 5 propositions because they link to each other, and you'll see how they tie into the dimensions as we go through the argument. I shouldn't say argument. I'm not trying to make an argument. I'm just trying to present an idea. And it's kind of come up here and there over the last 20 years since the Yale talk, and periodically I meet somebody in Australia or Washington or London and say, I remember the 3 dimensions of power. So I said, at least I got somewhere. So here are my 5 propositions. 1, that there is a spiritual dimension as well as a hard and soft dimension to political power, and that the exercise of such power depends on the character of the individual. 2, that the character of the individual as a whole is the single most important factor in how and why such political power is wielded. 3, that the pursuit, exercise, and retention of power is the single most important goal for anyone in the political arena. Their goal is to gain and retain political power. 4, that to this end, the creation, control, and use of information to establish the most appealing image is of paramount importance. And 5, that secrecy is the key to the creation, control, and use of information. Now, let me just make sure I have my outline in front of me so I don't start telling stories. Much is known and talked about in terms of hard and soft power, but little about the spiritual dimension and the role of character. And by character, I really want to emphasize that I'm thinking in broader terms than body, mind, and soul. It's the whole human being, ambitions, beliefs, prejudices, fears, values. In fact, the Hebraic concept of soul, which views man as an integrated whole created in the image of God, comes closest to what I mean by character. And obviously, character is a big issue in political life today, not just in America, but all over the world. So I think it is quite important to understand what character means. And again, we'll come back to that maybe in the Q&A. So what I've done is say, well, what's this battlefield made up of? What is this battlefield about? Where do those lines cross? Where does right and wrong, good and bad, actually join and meet each other? I just said to David at dinner, I'm trying to find the right word where these engage, and he's come up with line of skirmish. So you can think about it. Something's happening. Where does good actually engage with evil? And I've put down, I think, 7 headings under this. The elements, the places of engagement, or you can call theaters of action, on the battlefield where the battles over power include 1, ambition, 2, self-interest, 3, image, 4, information and control, 5, credit and blame, 6, information power circle, how information is used in the power circle to enhance one's power, and 7, secrecy and truth. In short, each of these elements has a spiritual, unseen dimension, and it's part of understanding what is actually going on. Under ambition, 1, man has always sought power. Such ambition is part of being human. and can be a laudable trait if directed to right and good ends and for the benefit of others as well as oneself. However, when appropriate ambition, having achieved its end, becomes inappropriate and the self-interested pursuit of power comes to dominate, we abruptly come to Lord Acton's famous quote that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And to this one might add, and a little power corrupts little people absolutely. But it is an axiom in politics for whatever Lord Acton lived, let's say 100 years ago, maybe 200 years ago, that it is that power corrupts. Self-interest is the second one I put down. Gary Wills writes in his famous book on Nixon called Nixon Agonistes, the pursuit of self-interest is a kind of duty in America. The pursuit of self-interest is a kind of duty in America. This has nothing to do with Nixon other than he's a product of America as well. And in my view, it's important to recognize that that pursuit of self-interest comes out of our love of individualism. And we pride ourselves about being individuals and how America enhances individualism. And that is true, and it's a great part of the American DNA. But it also has a flip side. And it's worth keeping that in mind whenever you get discussing individualism, because there is the negative side where that can go off the rails or become too important to the individual. That'll be implied in a lot of other things I have to say. So invariably, almost all leaders equate their desire to do what they think is in the best interest of their country, their constituency, with their gaining, exercising, and retaining power. The argument becomes, what's good for me is good for the nation. My self-interest is the same as the national interest. The great danger here is that it can lead to a belief that, as it is in the national interest that I be elected or re-elected, the end justifies the means. That is fundamental to what can go wrong when one takes self-interest to the extreme. Besides ambition and self-interest, what is it that most facilitates this drive for power and the delusion that what is best for me is best for the nation? The answer is found in the creation of an image. And again, there is a spiritual angle. Image, my third line of skirmish. Kissinger wrote in his memoirs, of course, every president carefully nurtures his own image. The obsessive pursuit of it, after all, brought him to where he is. So every president, every politician was very conscious of his image. And that's what he pursues because he knows that is what is going to get him to where he wants to go. Understanding the importance of a good image was not something unique to the Nixon White House. Indeed, we have no one better to thank than Machiavelli. And writing in the early 1500s, here's what Machiavelli wrote, which I think is so profound. A wise prince, then, is very careful never to let anything out of his mouth that is not a single word, not weighty with 5 qualities. He appears to those who see him and hear him talk all mercy, all faith, all integrity, all humanity, and all religion. No quality does a prince more need to possess in appearance than the last one, all religion. Isn't that profound in the Christian college? My goodness. Machiavelli further points out that negative qualities are necessary at times. For example, that cruelty prevail over mercy, stinginess over liberality, fear over love, duplicity over reliability. And he sums up, and again quoting, for a prince then, It is not necessary actually to have all of the above-mentioned qualities as are considered good, but it is very necessary to appear to have them. Doesn't that fit our society today? Fourth heading, information and control. All leaders, virtually without exception, want to create an image of the qualities identified by Machiavelli, quote, as are considered good. They in turn invariably embrace the role of secrecy and two related underlying assumptions. One, a strong conviction that information is power, but one must remember it is only so if it is relevant, timely, and most importantly, unknown to others. Two, the assumption that information is power for a leader primarily when it is used to gain credit for achieving those things that enhance his or her image. So credit is at the heart of information. In turn, the power flows back from the image because it is the image that is the key to gaining, exercising, and retaining power, which in turn further facilitates the creation of information. Openness, of course, diminishes the capacity to control, credit, and blame, and that's on the other side. But if you think about it, the game is all about getting credit and shifting the blame. But how does one create an image? How does one appear all mercy, faith, integrity, humanity, religious? The vehicle is essentially words. Words that convey good news or bad, good policies and bad, good results and bad. And for every bit of good news, policy, or result, everyone will want the credit. And for every bit of bad news, policy, or result, no one will want to bear the blame. Credit and blame. The key, therefore, is to get the credit for oneself, and when the news is good, and shift the blame to others when it is bad. The most effective way to do this is to have control of those words, and even to be the one that creates those words, announcing the news or the idea or the result. And this brings us to the information power circle, which goes, information leads to the power, and the power is used to get the credit, and the credit is used to enhance the image. And the image then brings more power and gives you the capacity to produce more information. It is the power that provides the capacity to create information to begin with, and in which case the picture becomes, as I've just said, a power-generating, creating circle, with the information being the critical starting point. The creation and control of information to get credit and shift the blame is thus the key to the expansion of power, and there is a limit to the amount of significant information that can be generated. Moreover, once used, that is made public, its power-enhancing capacity declines, obviously. Hence, the need to constantly create new information makes thoughtful politicians view their power at any given time as having a limited lifespan. Today's Twitter world is now the perfect environment for politicians to create a constant flow of new information as well as misinformation, disinformation in support and to enhance their image. Secrecy and truth. Showing the relationship between the use of words to create the right image and the goal of gaining, exercising, and retaining power, I've left at the end because it is the most important. For it is secrecy that enables one to create image and insulate it from reality, truth, and to make personal self-interest appear as part and parcel of the national interest. Secrecy is at the root of the image power base in liberal democracies and also in the non-democratic and authoritarian world that we all see all around us. It thus plays a subtle but pivotal role in enabling power to be retained by those in power in all societies. A certain level of secrecy may be critical to success in high diplomacy. For instance, during the time I was with Kissinger, we did set up 13 secret trips to Paris, which many books have been written about. One called Silent Missions by Vernon Edwards, who became the head of the CIA. But those secret trips took a huge amount of effort to make sure they were secret. And though in the end, they didn't come to anything, they were the basis for getting out of Vietnam. The same thing goes for the opening to China. That took a huge amount of effort to make sure they stayed secret. And with the strategic arms talks and the treaty that came out of that on the limiting of nuclear weapons with the Soviet Union, they were highly dependent on secrecy. In sum, secrecy is the handmaiden to the creation and control of information in the pursuit of power derived from image. Of course, at the center of this game is truth, what conforms to reality. It is obvious that truth is very much in play in today's political world. This is not something new. In fact, one can make a pretty good case that throughout history, truth has been in play. Obviously, sometimes more than others, but throughout history, there's been a question about truth in the biggest sense and in every individual's heart. My favorite quote in this connection is from John Locke. His memorial stone in Christchurch, he died in 1704, has this on it. I know there is truth, the opposite to falsehood, that it may be found if people will, and is worth the seeking. I know there is truth, the opposite to falsehood, that it may be found if people will, and is worth the seeking. If you think of all that Locke has written and what an intellectual impact he's had on Western civilization, on freedom, on America, on democracies, to have this as the one thing he wanted to have on his memorial tomb is really quite profound. In other words, truth has always been in play. And here he is in the late 1600s arguing his case, and they're all arguing about truth in Oxford. The use of secrecy is in large part a separate exercise to how and when to use or not use the truth. Okay, leave truth there, now we get to secrecy. Churchill once said that truth is so precious that she must often be attended by a bodyguard of lies. Great little picture. That was, of course, in wartime, but once in power, war or no war, the self-identity of most political leaders with the national interest seems to become so strong that they feel justified in using the truth by disclosure or non-disclosure, or by distortion, to pursue their own ends, to get the credit and stay in power. In common jargon, this whole practice now includes spin, and it may or may not have anything to do with revealing the truth, but it certainly has much to do with secrecy, image, power, credit and blame, and retaining power. I have a note to myself here. Somebody's going to make the case soon that Machiavelli was really the father of spin. You don't have to actually be honest and truthful. You just have to appear to be religious. You don't have to be religious. Go back, and the pieces in whatever that is, 1,500 to 2,500 years ago, this was set out. It's kind of a blueprint, I suppose, for all political leaders who take the time to read it. Okay, now we come to the heart of my argument, and I hope I'm not going to go too long. Okay, the spiritual dimension. How does the spiritual dimension relate to the battle for power, or these lines of skirmish, as David said? The notion of a spiritual dimension to the exercise of power, however, is not that new. In 1888, in his famous book, Ecce Homo, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote the following: "For when truth engages in struggle with the falsehood of ages, we must expect shocks and a series of earthquakes with the rearrangement of hills and valleys such as has never been dreamed of. The concept of politics is thus raised bodily into the realm of spiritual warfare." I want to repeat that sentence. The concept of politics is thus raised bodily into the realm of spiritual warfare. Nietzsche's conclusion that politics is a struggle between truth and falsehood is a matter of spiritual warfare is at the very heart of what I'm trying to convey. And Nietzsche's an atheist, and there's a straight line from Nietzsche through his sister to Hitler. All right? But he recognizes as an atheist that there's this level which he can't, other than spiritual, however we want to define it, unseen, supernatural. In fact, even more recently, after the Berlin Wall came down in November of 1989, we've all been watching the celebrations, the 30th anniversary the last couple of weeks. The Czech Prime Minister, Václav Havel, was in Tokyo in 1992, so 3 years after the wall came down. And in a public address, here's what he said: "When I look around the world today, I feel strongly that contemporary politics needs a new impulse, one that would add a badly needed spiritual dimension." And he was there during Prague Spring in '68, when they didn't get very far. But he knew there was another level. Let me further ground this idea or this argument looking at one of the most powerful real-life analyses of political power implied in the documentary Fog of War, 11 Lessons from the Life of Robert S. McNamara. Most of you will know he was Secretary of Defense for Jack Kennedy when he was president, and for LBJ. He ran Ford Motor Company before that, after the war, and taught at Harvard Business School for many years. And at the end, somebody said, "Can I do an hour on your life?" And it wound up as 15 hours, and he turned it into a documentary. It's actually won the Academy Award, got the Oscar in 2003, and is used now, is part of the intelligence programs in the U.S. government, the CIA and DIA. 11 lessons. 3 of McNamara's lessons relate to the hard dimension of power. Get the data, maximize efficiency. Proportionality should be a guideline in war. The next 3 relate to hard power. Soft power. Those 3 were hard. The next 3 are soft. Empathize with your enemy. Rationality will not save us. Never say never. And 5 are neither hard nor soft. Belief and seeing are often both wrong. Be prepared to re-examine your reasoning. In order to do good, you may have to engage in evil. You can't change human nature. And 5, there's something beyond oneself. What amazing reflection on his life. It's a whole separate library of books written about McNamara and his strengths and weaknesses, but his own insight into his life is quite profound. Finally, I would say that the most accurate and concrete description of what I'm talking about actually goes back 2,000 years or more the Apostle Paul, who wrote in Ephesians 6:12, quote, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this present world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." When I was in the White House and people would say to me, "What's it like?" I'd just say, "Read Ephesians 6:12." But it's not just the White House or that White House. It's the same thing over at number 10 Downing Street, or over the Kremlin, or the Élysée Palace in Paris. All these centers of power, that's where it's concentrated. And the devil's no dummy, so he's going to be concentrating on those high-value targets. Just think about it. Make believe you're the devil. Make believe you're going to try and take down this civilization, this creation. The fact that Nietzsche, the atheist, and the Apostle Paul agree that the exercise of political power is a matter of spiritual warfare must, at a minimum, challenge all of us to examine the reality of such a view. My conclusion: whether decisions are right or wrong, good or bad, it is not merely a matter of having good advisors or being an experienced and wise leader. In the end, it all comes down to the character of the individual exercising power and acting within the mystery that God is the God of history. Character shaped not just by physical and intellectual demands, but by spiritual values as well. It is only when we grasp the reality of this spiritual dimension of character that we appreciate that it means what it means to be fully human. This impacts both how we see ourselves, as well as how we see and treat others. It determines how we live our lives day to day, publicly and privately. Character, it's all about character. The man, David McCullough, who just finished his latest book on the pioneer days, told his publisher, who told me the other day, in all the books he's written, from Lincoln and Adams and the Founding Fathers, in the end, it's all about character. Thank you very much.